Let's see if you can go ahead and speak, and let's see if we can get you on the speakers here.
Yeah, I can see you. Can you hear me?
Right now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, it's not picking up the way I thought it would. Try one more time.
Check, check, 1, 2.
You guys can hear, can't you? Okay. All right. So, yeah, why don't you hold it, and then when it's time, we can put them up there if we need to. Hold the microphone and try to get it so they can hear it. All right. I think we're ready.
I'd like to call the September 25th meeting of the Gardner Planning Commission to order. Pledge allegiance, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Quorum is present. First item is the consent agenda. All items within the consent agenda have been distributed to each member of the Planning Commission for study. These items are considered to be routine and will be enacted upon by one motion with no separate discussion. If a separate discussion is desired on an item from the Planning Commission or from the floor, that item may be removed from the consent agenda and placed on the regular agenda. Are there any items members of the commission would like to have removed from the consent agenda? First, we got to do roll call. Am I right?
Commissioner Souza here.
Commissioner Ham here.
Commissioner McNair here.
Commissioner Mader here.
Commissioner Cooper here.
Okay, quorum is present. Sorry about that. Is there any item from members of the commission who would like to have removed from the consent agenda? Are there any items any member of the public would like to have removed from the consent agenda? Seeing none, can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Ham and second by Commissioner Meader. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. Okay. Okay. First item. First item is CUP-23-305-05. Staff may proceed.
Good evening. The applicant is requesting approval of a conditional use permit for a ground-mounted solar system. This is item 23-305-05. This is the first ground-mounted solar system permitted recently in the city. The solar systems we often see are roof-mounted, which are considered an accessory use and can be approved administratively. But since Table 5-2 of the Gardner Land Development Code requires a conditional use permit for the ground-mounted solar in all zoning districts, this item is appearing before you all. The subject property is located along 199th Street in the southeast portion of the city and was annexed in 2020. The lot area is 14.32 acres and has a residential house on it. It is located within the utility Evergy's service area. The properties to the east and west are also residential, while the property to the north and south are primarily used as farmland and are zoned agricultural. The conditional use permit is for a 40-panel ground-mounted solar system that has been installed. It is located in the rear yard, set back 517 feet from 199th Street. Because the electricity to the property is not provided by Gardner Electric, they do not require the usual interconnection process to be approved. Instead, the applicant has provided record of Evergy's approval for the project. The Gardner Municipal Code requires 2 specific standards for ground-mounted solar. The panels cannot exceed 8 feet in height and must be located within the rear yard at least 12 feet inside the property line, and the line serving the system must be located underground. The application documents show the panels are located in the rear yard, set back 76 feet from the western lot line and 388 feet from the rear lot line. They also show a PVC trench a minimum of 18 inches deep for the service lines. Staff finds the proposed use complies with the Gardner Land Development Code, with the City of Gardner Comprehensive Plan, and the applicant has complied with the specific use standards for ground-mounted solar. We also recommend there be no expiration date for the conditional use permit. Staff recommends the Planning Commission recommend approval of 23-305-05, a conditional use permit for ground-mounted solar at 26640 West 199th Street with the condition provided in the recommended motion.
Commission discussion? We have public hearing after. Susan?
I have a question.
Okay.
Why are we not requiring them to renew this ever?
Well, on a facility such as this, what would happen is this usually has a warranty with it, and the applicant may be able to speak to that. It usually has a lifetime warranty of so many years, so 15, 20 years, or whatever the technology and the batteries and the other elements of the system are that support this. So it's generally felt that if this system has to be replaced at any point, they would have to come back at that time, because this is specific to the system that's being put in today. We didn't want to limit it just based on a warranty projection or anything like that, but once the investment is made, there really is no moving part or nuisance parts to this element. If there are complaints from the neighbors that come up, we could have this permit come back to you for revocation consideration at that point. So for revocation, so you could potentially, based on complaints or some other issue, we could require the applicant to come back with this permit, and you could reconsider it to see if changes needed to be made on the conditions or the way it's been implemented, and then you could revise the permit if you approve it, or you could also revoke it and it would have to be removed.
That would be right now, or that would be
Down the road.
Complaint driven.
Yeah, complaint driven
Right.
generally is
So there's
what
really
does
no
that.
guardrail except if you get a.
Yeah, it's usually complaint driven, or the other thing is if a city inspector drove by and it's crumbled apart and it looks like junk out in the yard or something like that, it could be a nuisance element that the city could act on as well.
I have a question. So the solar panels are already installed, right? I mean, why they're?
I'm gonna let the applicant and the other staff address that, because there were timing issues with this application that went on for quite a long period of time. So I don't wanna misstate something, I'd rather the applicant address that question.
Because I thought the
for
permit
you.
was before it was mounted or.
Technically, that is what should
Oh, okay.
happen, yes.
Okay. That's why I was just curious.
Yeah, but I'd prefer that the applicant address that, or, through the discussion with staff after the public hearing.
Any other questions? This is a public hearing item, so I'd like to open a public hearing on this. Comments are limited to 5 minutes unless you have an attorney, then 7 minutes.
Yeah, and I would say the applicant is on the Zoom call, so we're gonna try to hook him up here and let him speak first. So, we're gonna hope it works, right? Yeah. He's leaning into his phone, so hopefully he can hear us.
So you guys can hear the question. Was it just about the timing of it?
Yeah, it had to do with the timing. I'm gonna try to hold you up here and see if we can make this work.
Okay. All right. So I muted the computer. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
All right. Good evening. Yeah. So there was a little bit of timing issue. I had never had to go through this before. So what we had done is we came in and applied for the permit. The permit was issued. We were ready for it to be issued, so we went ahead and installed the system basically the next day. I believe Jesse or whoever was in the office that had reached out to me about a contingent permit that we had not done. So I immediately drove down to Gardner, met with them, and got that filed and filled out. Does that answer the question? It's vague to hear on here, sorry.
I can hear.
Yeah, we can hear you, we can hear you on this end fine, so yes, they heard
Okay.
that.
And who is the individual, name and address?
Is there any other questions I missed?
Yeah.
Can you just go ahead and give your name and address for the record? This is the applicant, so.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, I can. Yeah, my name is Matt Bolig. I live at 9240 Parallel Parkway, Kansas City, Kansas. And that is also the business address as well. And I apologize for not being there today. I've got a newly pregnant wife, and we're not trying to catch any bugs or anything like that. We had to do it the hard way. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me, though.
Okay. Matt, did you have anything else that you want to do, say in regard to the application tonight at all?
Just to kind of reiterate what you were saying about the warranty. So the warranty is 25 years for the panels, could be up to 30 years. If they want to choose that at 25 years, the inverter itself and the rapid shutdown system that is installed under each module is 25 years. And then we warranty everything for 10 years as far as like labor, whether that be wires or a squirrel chew through a wire or anything like that. That's between us and the customer, but that's something that we would not allow to look like crumbled mess in the yard at all.
Okay.
Here for questions.
Yeah, I was gonna say if there's any questions.
Yeah, so the applicant is not the resident?
Yeah.
He's-
Yeah,
he's
yeah, the
one
resident,
of kind.
the resident is here as well.
Residents here as well.
Yeah.
So Call Valley installed it without getting the proper permitting?
Correct, that's,
Well, you got the permits up front, and there was a
Yeah.
different permit on top of that.
right. So generally, I'm gonna let Jesse kind of respond to this, usually within the city of Gardner, city electric handles that, right? So it's Gardner Electric, and where this would normally be caught is when they come in for the utility interconnection permit. So if they were coming here to the city, most of the time, these are caught because the city utility requires that interconnection review, and then they bring it forward. In this particular case, this is a property that's out on 199th Street, out in the rural area, out east, and it's in Evergy's area. So Evergy approved the interconnection permit, correct, before, and they were unaware that they needed a conditional use permit from here. The work was scheduled to get done immediately after the permit was issued, the interconnection permit was issued by the utility. They were not made aware of that issue until after that scheduling for the work and everything else. So that's why we're catching it after the fact.
And then everything as far as like the plans and different things like that are stamped and sealed by a licensed engineer on both sides, electrical and structural. We also upgraded his 2 meters that were there. We combined it into a 400 amp panel under just us. We just paid for that. That was something Evergy had brought up at the post inspection. So Evergy has approved the system completely. This was the final step for us at least.
Any other questions for Matt?
Any other questions?
Hold on to this, keep Matt on the line for now. We just have to see if there's anybody else here that wants to comment.
Anybody else in the public wants to make a comment or ask a question from the public? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Ham, second by Commissioner Mader, to close the public hearing. Public hearing is now closed. Okay.
And Mr. Chair, I'm gonna go ahead and just reiterate a couple things so that people understand. One of the big differences here, Again, roof-mounted solar would not even come before the planning commission by code. It is one of those things that is allowed as an accessory use. It goes through the same interconnection process. So customers who are putting solar panels onto their roof, you know, as far as their house, if they're in Gardner, they would go through the interconnection process with Gardner Utilities or Gardner Electric. In the Evergy area, they go to Evergy. And we are now, as a community, getting into some of these other service areas, and that's where some of these problems pop up with the ground mounted, but we also now have Water One serving customers within Gardner. Evergy's now serving some of the customers in Gardner as well, and that used to not be the case until we started expanding primarily to the east side of I-35, where we have other service providers that we need to coordinate with. So I think some of that coordination issue is just making sure those utilities are aware of what's required within the city limits when they get calls like this.
Just a question for staff. So if I understand this correctly, you know, what kind of happened was this is a little bit outside the norm of a normal approval process in that this Gardner Energy was not involved in the application, the approval process, and this would have been something that Gonz's department would have identified.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, because it would have come forward to us through them, essentially.
And look through the document. In our home and residence here in town, we personally have solar on our property, and so I've been through the entire process. And that's the only thing I could think of that we would have been able.
Yeah, the difference here is really the fact that we weren't dealing with Gardner Electric. So when this contractor went to Evergy approved the system, they went through their process. We were never notified of it until it was caught.
Okay, that was the question I had in my mind this afternoon, is why is this even coming before us?
Well, and the answer to that question is, for some reason in our LDC, the ground-mounted systems are dealt with differently, and they are treated as a structure that requires a conditional use permit, no matter what zoning district it is in. That is something that, from a staff perspective, we feel that with the way technology is going and with the need for some of these things, we don't know that a conditional use permit will need to be in the future. We just want to make sure we have the right standards. Right now, the standards are very minimal. It's just the setback and the height. That's all that's looked at as far as a standard on that from a code perspective.
So are you saying that at some point down the road at LEC,
It's
modifications
possible.
should be made
It's possible that that's going to be brought before you as a modification, but it'll be grouped with other items. It won't necessarily be on its own, and then you can debate whether you want to change it, don't want to change it, or where you want to go with it in the future. The technology is changing so much on some of these systems, and so the reality of it is we have a code that's a little bit aged in that sense. But the concerns that we always have with ground-mounted solar obviously have to do with things of how does this affect your neighbor's property, right? It can be glare off of the panels. It can be any number of things. In this particular situation where you have 14 acres of land and this item is placed well in the back and also off the property line quite a distance, that's what staff recommendation is for approval of this. We don't see this as a problem. If we were dealing with a typical quarter-acre lot in a subdivision in Gardner, the opinion might be different on something this large.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one, just for commission discussion. I'm personally I'm not comfortable with there not being an expiration date. I just feel like I'm trying to think back through historical times where a CUP just came before the planning commission. I cannot think of a single time where it's never been no expiration. It might be well into the future. Like, for example, we heard that 25 years is warranty. So perhaps we do time bind it, so at least there's those guardrails versus no expiration. I don't personally see an issue with at least providing for some type of an expiration. Just knowing that there is a warranty versus no expiration at all. Just have those guardrails in place. And I think, so then the other one, it doesn't exceed the 8 feet height, I've never looked at these types of plans before, so it took me a minute to kind of ground myself. But it looks like, yeah, they're showing 8 feet in height, no taller than that, so that meets the one of the standards, right? The required standards, and then obviously the property line, everything's underground that I could tell based on the plans. So my only advisement is that we should put in some timeline guardrails into the motion for the for this CUP.
To build off of what Commissioner Mader says, on other projects like this that go through the normal, like Gardner utilities, is there a time limit on those, or are those indefinite or in perpetuity?
This is the first one that we've had that I know of. I think Jesse referenced it for ground-mounted solar in the community. So we really don't have a reference point for this type of a structure here. So there's no opposition if the commission feels like a time frame of 20 years, 25 years, something that corresponds with the warranty is appropriate. That's fine. We can alter your motion as you see fit from that standpoint. Again, we don't really have a reference point for this. The rooftop solar panels, because they're not conditional use permits, they are allowed once they're in place. They're allowed to go forever, and that's kind of how I think staff looked at this. Is if we're allowing that on a roof, why wouldn't we allow it as a ground mounted? So, but certainly we're not necessarily opposed to adding a timeline to this.
Well,
Question, so what are the implications of not having a time limit? What's the difference? I don't understand. What's the?
Well, the time limit would be a mandatory time at which this would expire, and it would have to come forward if that item is still intact and still, producing energy for this particular property owner. So the difference would be is that that is a mandatory timeline, and Commissioner Mader is right about many of the other conditional use permits may have a 5-year or a 10-year period or whatever it is, and the idea is at that period it gets reassessed, and it may be even obsolete at that point because that item may no longer exist for all we know. So in many ways, that's where the timeline or the time frame gets placed onto these permits, is to basically sit there and say, okay, at this time we do want to relook at this and see that there isn't a condition there that is a violation. The other part is codes can change. So understand this conditional use permit may be valid for current, right? And it's an unlimited as shown. But let's say they do let's say there's a tornado or there's something that goes on with it that removes that system. They could, with that conditional use permit, replace or put in a new system. That's why the condition that we've written in here was mainly to say any future change or movement or expansion or replacement would have to come forward, because we were concerned about the idea of, okay, this thing disappears for whatever reason. We don't want them to just come back and assume that whatever new system under some new technology is appropriate at that time, because again, codes could change. We could have a different series of events that happen there. So I think that's the biggest item is here is that mandatory return. Like I explained earlier, what you do have in place here is if there were a complaint about these panels or this situation, the current approval would still be subject to potential revocation, because the complaint would drive us to reopen the conditional use permit and bring it back to you at that point in time. So, but it's more of a mandatory timeline, which sometimes it's just more comfortable to have that.
Well, and roofs have to be replaced.
Whatever,
Every 20,
15,
25
20 years, depending on the quality of the materials.
Right.
So.
So even though we don't have a time frame for homeowners and mounting on roofs, there's kind of a built-in time frame.
They have to deal with those.
Yeah.
The difference is if that was cause for replacement, they would not have the conditional use permit requirement because it's a roof mounted.
Would they have to get a permit again?
They'd have to get their interconnect permit, yes.
Again?
Yeah, they would have to go through the process.
Typically what would happen, I can speak for our own installation to answer your question. As a homeowner here in Gardner that does have solar on the roof, most systems do come with a 25-year warranty. The expected lifespan of a system is 25 years. Let's say we had a hailstorm and it came through and tore up our roof, tore up the panels, tore up a lot of stuff. To have a roof replaced just because it's worn out, the homeowner would have to, on a roof-mounted system, the homeowner would have to pay the installer or a certified installer to remove the panels, replace the roof, and then pay to have the panels put back onto the roof. So, that's the way that works. And so, and then typically also the roof will last longer under the panels because it's protected from the sun and the elements. As far as a long-term situation, for use, I guess my question would be this: how does this structure, as a conditional use permit structure, differ from, let's say, a garage or an outbuilding or another outbuilding on a property?
Well, most outbuildings or accessory structures, okay, are allowed without a conditional use permit. So even in this property owner's case, he's allowed to have a certain number of accessory structures up to a certain number of square feet based on the size of the property and the home. And so those are allowed without conditional use permits. I can't speak to why this particular type of structure was placed in the code as a conditional use permit piece.
So we could see
So,
it, if I remember
yeah.
correctly, when we rewrote the land development code, that was one of the call-outs was, this might seem ticky-tacky, but it could be deemed, as a potential nuisance use.
Right.
So it's really more, I think, about the use.
Because
right?
of the glare
Because
and
of the
things
glare
like that.
and you could,
Right.
it could get out of hand. So I
Right.
think that's why that guardrail was put in place within the land development code for solar collectors.
Yeah.
Best recollection was in 2018.
Yeah, it was a while back.
Yeah, almost 10 years.
In the terms of the technology we're talking about, that was like generations ago.
Well, and that's the other part of these kinds of things, especially in the energy field. Wind energy is the same way. Geothermal, all of those kinds of systems are evolving. Okay, battery capacities are changing. There's a whole lot of different parts to this that when you look at it, even the code being written back in the 20-teens, that was with what they knew about the technology at that point in time. Now technology has changed. There's been things done with some panels where the glare is reduced. There's a lot of things that have happened in the industry that this code would not have necessarily anticipated. And
Typically, that would be like matte finishes on panels and things like
Yeah.
that.
yeah, there's different.
Well, at the time this was done, what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of things that we didn't know that we do know about systems like this of this nature today.
Right.
And
they are still evolving to be more efficient. So you may find, at some point, we may find these units actually become smaller but generate the equivalent energy or even better, just like computer systems, right? It's that same kind of thing that as things evolve, they can tend to get more efficiency, smaller units. This is just a unit that's here in today's technology. This is the size of it. This is how it's installed, and we try to keep the code up to date as much as we can. And in many ways, I think Commissioner Mader's right. One of the reasons you do a conditional use permit here is because that technology is changing, and they may have to come forward at some point with a new solution and go, well, it's impossible for us to meet your standard here, and here's the reason why. We've got to become aware of that.
would it, as far as putting guardrails on this, would it be appropriate to consider guardrails of any that we maybe consider changes in technology or alterations to design or content rather than just timeline?
I don't think any of us were seeing on that.
Yeah.
I think from just the legal perspective, that's probably a little too much.
Okay.
You get into enforceability of what constitutes a technological change. I think, adding a time condition makes sense based on your conversation, but what staff has proposed as a condition probably encompasses if there's a change in technology sufficient enough to warrant
structure of this setup, then it's gonna fall under this condition.
Yeah, because I was, typically systems of this, a homeowner, if they have a complete system installed with battery and the whole 9 yards of this size, you're typically talking about an investment of well over $100,000. And that's a lot of money to be able to come back and say, well, time's up, gotta take it out.
No, it would just be, we're not saying you have to take it out. It would just be 25 years, come back with, here's what we're doing with it.
Okay.
It's not a timeline to remove, it's a timeline to review.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it
yeah,
could be denied too.
it could be,
Yeah.
you never know, but I don't like to do things that have no expiration date. I feel that just establish it.
I'm
Best
comfortable with Commissioner Mader's suggestion, just because, I mean, if we don't put a time limit on in 26 years and it crumbles and they're like, whatever. So, just leave it, yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
What type of a timeline are we talking about here as far as renewal?
I'm prepared to make a motion if there's no other questions, and I'm filling for 25 years, and let's see if we get consensus.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
I could probably live with that because most of the useful life of these systems is about 25 years. And if we're not requiring to come back up for conditional use consideration for basically the useful life of the system, I'm good with that. At this point, I entertain a motion.
Really quick, before there's a motion, Commissioner Combs, since you were just a little late and missed part of the public hearing, do you have any questions you want answered, even if it's repetitive to the rest of us, to make sure you can make an informed decision?
No questions.
Okay, sorry, I just want to make sure. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I'm glad you said something.
I'd entertain a motion.
Okay, sure. After review of application 23-305-05, a conditional use permit for a ground-mounted solar collector located at 26640 West 199th Street and staff report dated September 20, 2023, the Planning Commission recommends approval for the issuance of such permit for a time period to not exceed 25 years with the following condition, item number 1, as presented in the staff report.
Second.
So we have a motion from Commissioner Mader and a second from Commissioner Ham. Any comments or discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 6-0.
And this does go forward to the city council for final decision, so that'll happen, I believe, it's in October, it's the 16th, so that'll be on October 16th, so, okay?
Excellent. Any,
He can go. Okay. All right. So, you're good to go.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Do we have any?
do we have any other business?
Let me just make sure, so, I didn't know if there was any discussion from the commissioners at all.
I have an issue that I'd like to bring up. It's not related to the issue that was on our agenda today, so if you would need to leave, you're good, I think.
Yeah, they're good at it.
And the reason that I'm bringing this up at our meeting is because we're not allowed to have conversations without it being considered a potential FOIA or sunshine violation. So I wanted to address this with everybody here. And I talked to Dave about this previously, I think, if I remember correctly. And that is that when developers come before us, there's a resolution that the Planning Commissioner puts into place that is in favor of the developer. But that does not mean that we have to accept those resolutions as written. And my concern is that we do have some leverage, and there was a presenter at one point in the not so distant past that was very condescending and gave me the impression that the concerns about the neighborhood were not his. Obviously, he doesn't live here, But when we allowed the passage of that, then we compromised maybe compromise is not the right word, but we basically didn't take into consideration the fact that there were 30 or 40 people here when we passed that, and they were not happy with it. And my concern is that we do have some leverage, and we can say no, and they can go back to the drawing board and come back to us. And then we can maybe get something that's more acceptable to neighborhoods. But my concern is that when it's an outside developer and they come into our community, they're not going to be held accountable. Once their development is done, they're gone. And I just had a concern about that, and I had a concern that maybe we weren't all aware that we don't have to go by these resolutions as they are written in the book. That's what they provide because that's their job. But it's our job to represent the community. At least that's how I feel about this job. And I respect all of you. I know you put in a tremendous amount of time for these meetings, and you're very thoughtful about it, about what you bring to the table, and I really appreciate that, and I want to acknowledge that. But I think there might be some short-sightedness in terms of our allowing things to move forward without taking a step back.
I'm going to clarify a couple things just to make sure. So, and I believe what you're referring to that you've talked about as resolutions are the recommended motions.
Yes.
That's the key. So I want to just make sure for everybody. So when we bring forward a recommended motion from the staff's perspective, understand our job at a certain point is up to the time you're seeing this item, we're evaluating it per the code. Okay, so we're looking at the code only. We don't get the benefit of the public hearing when we do that. So one of the things that we try to understand is what could be the impacts on the neighborhood, what might be going on, and we also try to work with the developer before that comes forward to you to try to mitigate those anticipated items or those anticipated issues. So the recommended motion, while we have a recommendation from the staff, the recommended motion does not mean you have to pass that recommended motion. I think like tonight with Commissioner Mader, where we added or changed the condition or the reading of it, I do want people to understand you can make a motion different than what's recommended to you, okay? That's usually there as an outline or a beginning or a start point because we've all seen this, Spencer's seen it, where boards have struggled to put wording together for motions. So the idea is we can't necessarily as staff anticipate every possible motion you might like to make on an item. So certainly what we tend to do is we try to put the motion together based kind of on our recommendation at that point in time where we're at. There are times that I also feel like after the public hearing that we could as staff sit there and say, hey, based on this input, staff might be changing its recommendation at a certain point. If we have that situation with us, we're going to let you know. So if we hear something in the public hearing that we didn't at least anticipate, okay, it's some new information or something like that, we may verbally say something to you about the recommended motion, or we might say something where, hey, based on these 5 things that were brought up, we need to add these conditions, or we should do these things, okay? So just be aware of that. So Commissioner Cooper is right, and I want to make sure everybody understands this. You have the final say on the motion that you wish to make and vote on as a group, okay? The second part of this that I just want to make sure of, there are some things that you are the decision-making group on, and there are some that you are recommending on. And I want you to also understand the effect. If you are sometimes recommending denial of an item, understand the governing body is still the decision-making authority in a lot of these items. So, but what you're triggering is the potential for a supermajority vote, if you will. You have to come up with more. Now, that doesn't come into play as much with our city council because we have 6 members on the governing body, and a simple majority is the same number as a 2/3 majority. So it's 4 votes of the council either way. What really triggers the supermajority or the 3/4 requirement is the protest petition if the neighborhood or somebody who's opposed to that qualifies on the protest side files a protest. And that's why a number of these items do not go to the governing body until their second meeting of the following month after your meeting. 14-day petition or protest petition period following the public hearing. So like tonight, if we would have had property owners up here protesting and you decided to make a recommendation to approve and they weren't happy with that, the property owners that were within the notification area around this property could submit a protest petition, and if found valid and found to meet the requirements of state law, it would trigger the need for the city council to actually get that supermajority vote to pass that. So they do have an influence on that. Even if your recommendation is for approval and they feel slighted by that, there is the official protest methodology that they have available to them as well. So some of this is moving parts, you know, it's there, but the reality of it is I believe what Commissioner Cooper is bringing up is just understanding again that you do have the ability, do not just look at the staff's recommended motion that's seen up here and just go, well, that's our recommendation, that's what we're making. So if you do hear things in the public hearing, it's absolutely important that you have those discussions, and somebody can make a motion that's very different than that and have it voted on.
I just don't want to be a rubber stamp.
Well, Commissioner Cooper, I think you stated some very things very clearly and very well. First off, you have a duty and an obligation, really, that if you disagree with something that is before you, you have an obligation, really, to voice your opinion, voice your opposition.
I do when I have a disagreement.
And to become part of the discussion, and to make sure that the rest of us understand completely where you're coming from and where your concerns lie, because that's a major part of the job that we all have up here, and you're to be committed to those feelings.
Well, and I did. I brought it up when it occurred, but I just didn't know if everybody really understood, because I didn't initially, that we do have some leverage, and we can take into consideration the community and their interests. We don't have to just rubber stamp whatever's written.
Okay, so
in the book.
just for clarification point, even though like there were certain things that I did not like in that particular case, we still have to abide by the land development code.
Right.
So
and if it checks the boxes, we've got some
Right.
obligations.
Well, let's be careful about just checking boxes too, because I hear what you're saying, and I want people to understand that there are review criteria that we can consider based on the LDC, or we have to consider, okay, based on the code. And that's why sometimes we'll have conversations and a question may come up, and I'm gonna use an example in a generic way, and you'll hear staff, we cringe real quick on this one, and I believe Commissioner McNear knows this, and I know Commissioner Mayer knows this from past. When we're talking sometimes about housing developments and people go, well, we don't want renters. That is off limits.
Right.
You know, that's not a criteria, whether it's ownership or rental. And many times when we see that boundary being pushed, you'll see staff intervene and say, you can't really ask that question. That's really not part of your considerations. That's not. So when we see that, we try to be the guardrails for you. I'm gonna use the popular term for
we
tonight.
appreciate it.
And so we try to be that guardrail that sits there, and that's why Spencer's here next to me many times, is if we're entering into a discussion territory that's really outside the purview, then we've got to be careful. So we have to watch when the public does bring up some items. There are some things that are not in our purview as staff and then aren't in your purview. It may seem unfair to the citizens at that point in time, but the reality is that's where the code comes into play and says, hey, this is what we do. So that's why we give you in the staff report either the reference or the listing of the review criteria that the code has said we are looking at this from these perspectives. Now, we try to tell the public when they talk to us ahead of time, if they do, we try to let them know those review criteria and say, hey, make your arguments in those parameters if you can, because those are the ones that we're really looking at. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit.
Well, yes.
Checking the
and
boxes.
I know.
I don't
and
want
that-
it to seem robotic either, because there are times when the public does bring up something that the staff, hey, we didn't think about that impact, and we're hearing it for the first time, just like you're hearing it for the
Like
first time.
rewriting streets and things like that to
Correct.
make
Mhm.
things accessible. So that's where I thought that we were asserting our authority or our leverage when we were doing those items, whether or not we agree on the feelings of the community, we still have to work within a set parameter. And I felt like that's what we were doing when we were making some of those decisions. And
Well, and I think you've had situations where you basically, I don't want to call it table, what do I want to call it? Wasn't table, but essentially sent it back for further discussion. You deferred it till the next month, or you do. Those are certainly well within your purview with instructions to say, hey, we want you guys to look at this closer with the applicant to see if they can be addressed adequately and bring that to us. So you do have those opportunities to do that as well. So you can make those motions and say, hey, here's a motion. I think they need to look at this closer. We've got citizens that are upset about it, but you have to give us the direction of what we're to look
Right.
at. The thing that's nice about that is when we have those kinds of applications, you have that ability to do that. The governing body does also. So even if you do it with an applicant, and you sit there and say, okay, I want to extend this, I want them to look at it closer, they come back to you with a revision, you make your recommendation. The city council, the governing body, may still also go, that's not quite good enough. Or it's, that's not what I really want to see. Is there a better way to handle it? And they can hold that item up there to have further study as well. So I think what's hardest for a lot of people to understand is each unit in the decision-making chain, if you will, has a different role. And it's okay that we don't all see things the same way. It's perfectly fine. Staff gives you what they can from the time the application officially comes in to when you see it, which is usually with very minimal public input. We sometimes will get calls ahead of time, or citizens will come in and they'll say, hey, I've got concerns, I'd like to look at the plans, and we have a discussion with them. And that may influence how staff works with that applicant before it comes to you. But that doesn't happen on every case, and sometimes we just don't see the public until the night of the hearing, and we don't even know that there's an issue out there. And it'd be nice to know, because sometimes we can work things out before you even see it, with the consideration of the public. But I'm saying that for the benefit of whoever watches this video in the future, so that they should know when an application is received, they have just as much right from the moment I have that as a public record to view that public record, and if they have questions, to talk with staff so that we can talk with them and see what concerns they may have and what's going on. The way the application is set up, and I know I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, but the way the application review is set up, when you see this item here tonight in September, this item technically is supposed to be filed in the first Monday of August. So they're getting almost 2 months of review time. When the application comes in, we check it to make sure that it's meeting the requirements to be a valid application. That's our first week. We try to get that done. After that, then they go through a complete staff review with all the departments in the city. There's a group of reviewers from each of the technical aspects of the city who look at this. Then those comments go to them. They make adjustments to their plans based on those comments and reviews. Then we have a second round of review because we may find other issues or we may find refinements. And that's why many times by the time we're getting to writing our staff report, we've reviewed this as a staff team 2 times. We've addressed technical issues, items that are addressing code items, so that many of the boxes are checked. And that's why usually you're seeing recommendations from us of the affirmative, okay? Because at that point, that's where we're at in the process. We generally, if we really believe something's gonna have a real hard time, that applicant, we make them aware of it from the very beginning. And we've even slowed down review processes with applicants because of either the way they've responded or the amount of detail that we're requiring from them. So we try to do that in our role. Your too. I've
process.
lived that, and, you know, I've lived that situation. It's just a matter that we all have a little different role, and we just gotta respect those roles. So I went a little further. I know for Commissioner McNear and Commissioner Mader, you've probably heard this similar kind of conversation multiple times, but for the rest of you, you know, in the last couple of years where you've come on board, we probably have not talked in that much detail about it.
I'd like to make a couple comments. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I think Commissioner Mader's done it even more, longer. I can honestly say this is the best group of planning commissioners I've ever had the pleasure to work with. Y'all are doing a great job, asking the right questions, asking hard questions, and really, we're coming together. We've had a couple pieces of work we've done this year that have had, I think, stellar results. And when you look at what actually ultimately got approved in some of these cases versus where it started, I think this body has done a tremendous job. Thank you.
I just want to say something. I just want to thank Commissioner Cooper for bringing that up. I think it was important that because sometimes I felt that out pressure, you know, like, you know, all this, the developers and all these people. So it was nice that you brought it up, and that, you know, we have the ability to make changes. Not
This-
go with.
Your role, this is not an easy job, okay? I just want to make sure one of you understands that. This is not an easy job. And even as codes become more complex, kind of like this, where you're into some design details, you know, that many cities don't consider, quite frankly. So you have quite a few things here that fall into the consideration of the LDC, the code here. It gets more and more difficult, and the questions get more and more complicated, and they should, because you're in some details that need to be honed out. And not everything should feel like a rubber stamp. Now, there's some items that, you know, you look at and you go, okay, why is this even here, right? It's one of those things, and we do it because that's what the code is leading us towards, and that's the process we have to go into. But certainly, it's not easy, and you probably are wrangling with a lot of the votes and decisions that you're making on those things, and then you're really hoping it turns out, because it's got to hit a certain quality standard at the end of the day.
I might go on record and say I personally spent nearly a decade on the other side. And since February, when I had the honor to join, I've learned quite a bit, mostly from the point of balancing one's emotions. Because it's extremely emotional when you're in a public hearing and your property is being impacted in some way, directly or indirectly, no matter what that may be. And as I've tried to work through that balancing act, you do realize the details that are really behind the scenes. And, you know, certainly the work that the staff does, without a doubt. So I very much, Commissioner Cooper, totally agree with you for bringing it up. I, as you know, one of the younger, in terms of tenure, maybe even an age, I'm 45, I'm still a baby. But I would encourage, you know, certainly even from the staff direction as needed. I would only close in saying pretty much where I started, the balancing act that we have here can be just that. It is a challenge to leave the emotions on the side and also not behind.
Well, thank you. I was going to say, even tonight is a perfect example of what we're talking about. I think what everybody's talking about here. We had probably 4 or 5 or 6 different versions of thoughts of what this item before us this evening needed to look like. You know, from, let's kick it back to let's have without conditions or whatever. And by the time we were finished with discussion and by the time we were finished with the process, we came together as a commission and voted 6-0 unanimously to approve and agree. And I think that's a huge statement to all of you. Thank you. It really is. It's because we were able to come together and hear each other out and weigh the concerns and come together with a motion that worked.
And I'm gonna go a step further here, and only because of today's political climate, and I'll leave it at that. The important thing is, even if you have a split vote on this group, it is not a personal vote. It should not be one of those things that divides you as a planning commission. Commissioner McNear makes a really good point. You're coming from different viewpoints. That's why you have different people sitting up here that may be different ages, okay, and have different backgrounds and everything else. It brings different perspectives to the table. And so we're very fortunate to have that on this group. The key is understanding that there still will be times that you will be divided. There'll be times that it's not unanimous, and if it's not, that's fine. Okay, that is part of the documentation of the record and where we're at. So I just wanted to make that clear, because at a local level of governance, it's very important that we never lose that perspective. At the end of the day, there's long-range and short-range items that impact the community as a whole, and your job is to look at the community as a whole. To sit there and say, from my perspective within this grander community, I may actually have to make a vote that I'm not real thrilled with personally, but it is the best for the community as a whole. And that's where the perspective comes in, and that is not just easy check the box. So I guess I go back to Commissioner Hand's comment. I don't want to discount what you're saying, but I also don't want it to seem robotic to you that we're just checking boxes, because it's much more than that. You know.
Well, no, I don't think it's checking boxes. I think we have to balance our duty to the land development code with the emotions that we feel. That vote that I made on that one case was heart-wrenching, but it fell within the guidelines of the land development code.
I just want to add one thing. When I was talking to Spencer earlier today, he shared that he does this for several other communities, and he does a training. And I just thought it might be useful for us, since many of us haven't been on the commission for a long time and we don't have the experience that Commissioner Mader and McNair have. Maybe it would be helpful if we went through that training. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, and it's a pretty quick PowerPoint. It'd be probably about as long as tonight's conversation was. And I think my training for Commissioner Combs when you come on was don't hit reply all, and that's about all you got. So happy to get further for you guys.
I got that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can get that on. The other thing I wanted to add is just, it doesn't offend staff if you say, I don't like the motion you put up here. Can we do this instead? There's a lot of experience up here between all of us. So we're here to help you redo a motion that fits with what you guys want, and take out any, unnecessary or things that you didn't intend to say in that motion, and make a clean motion. And we can sit here and workshop it and get that done. So don't be afraid to say, I don't like this motion. I think we should do something similar that's still in approval with, like tonight, we added a new condition to it. So, don't be afraid. That's not going to offend staff. We all have pretty thick skin.
Or you can hold my hand as I stumble over my words as I do a motion.
I think it's important that you and staff are here to help guide us to the correct words and the use of language to get what we intend to put forth, because most of all, we want to make sure that whatever we do at the end of our process is that we don't put the city into a real legal position that could be hard to defend, and that's kind of the major thing. That's why we'll always defer to you guys and say, this is what we're thinking. How do we do this?
Yeah, and don't get discouraged if you make a long motion and we stop you and have you re-say it again, because there's a couple words flubbed up, because we've all been there where you're talking and you're not noticing a mistake you made, and everyone else is armchair quarterbacking, and we're like, oh, we gotta read it. Don't get offended, don't get discouraged, make the next one. But yeah, it's a process, so yeah, you guys are an important role.
Excellent. I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion to adjourn by Commissioner Ham, second by Commissioner Mader. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous.
And one just quick item, in case you try to get hold of me, I am gonna be out of town the rest of this week, so I will not